I try to be as messy as possible because I need to dismantle the perfectionist, right? Like a sculptor works with clay and they're given the clay that they then are shaping and shaping. But as a writer, we have to make our own clay, which is like the raw materials of the words. So there's all kinds of ways that I work to dismantle my own perfectionism so that I can get enough clay that I can then begin to sculpt later in the editing process.
Hi, welcome to the podcast. My name is Katie, and this week I am speaking to one of my favorite authors ever. Melissa Broder is here. She's the author of several novels, including most recently Death Valley, and then Milk Fed, and The Pisces, and the essay collection So Sad Today, and then 5 poetry collections, including Super Doom and The Last Sext. Her books have been translated into over 10 languages. She's written for the New York Times, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, Vice, New York Magazine, and many more. And she's here to talk to us. Can you believe it? I'm stoked. We talk a little bit about how we met many years ago in New York and this, and I could have talked to her longer because I love her and her work so much. And she was such a delight to speak with. But I did talk to her for quite a bit, so I'm breaking this into 2 parts. So this week you'll hear the first part of our conversation where we talked about wellness. She recently had written a piece, or it came out earlier this year, about wellness and wellness culture and capitalism and the intersection of it all. So we start by talking about that. We speak about her writing process, mental health. We talk about sharing writing. We talk about limerence and long-term relationships and being seen and witnessed, and her books. We talk about So Sad Today and The Pisces and Milk Fed a little bit in this. And then in part 2, we talk about Death Valley. We talk about grief. We talk about losing a parent. It's heavy, but it's also light because we talk about our favorite grocery stores and vanity and aging and bodies and her mindset around all of that, and writing prompts and how to be consistent with writing and so much more. So anyway, that's all coming up this week and next. I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. So here it goes. Here's me talking to the incredible Melissa Broder.
Well, then also I feel like for the past 5 years since Zoom came on the frontier, I've been staring at myself. Whenever I'm on a Zoom with anyone, I'm looking at myself about 70% of the time. So it's really nice to not.
I know. I mean, yeah, I've set it up like that, but really it's selfish because it's going to be distracting for me to see myself during the time. And I don't want to ruin it.
I'm just so stoked that you're here. Thank you for doing this. And I don't know if you remember, but you probably do, only because we've had this email chain, which I haven't even it would be so embarrassing for me to read the initial email that I emailed you after this, but the subject line says it all, which is Arby's girl from your meetup.
Yes.
And that must have been 2017, 2018, something like that.
The Taco Bell meetup.
Yes. And I love that is still the email chain to book this podcast. And we've chatted over the years many times, and I met you here too, but you were so kind to send me an early copy of your last book, and I sent you a book I was doing PR for, but it's all been under that email chain, which is just makes me so happy.
Arby's has been the great continuity. It's like Proust's Madeleine.
It really is. And you said when you did a reading that I came to, Nada's reading a couple of years ago, and I don't think Death Valley was even, or definitely wasn't out yet, but you read the first chapter, and then you told me after, you're like, Arby's is in it.
Totally. Arby's is the great existential, it's Rosebud. It's Citizen Kane's Rosebud. Yeah, can we just talk about Nada for a second?
Oh, please. All day. She's the greatest.
Nada Alik. So shout out to Nada's book, Bad Thoughts. It's funny as hell and wonderful. And yeah, just a lot of fun. So if listeners haven't read.
We did.
That's my first rec.
She's been on the podcast, and I had to break it into two parts because I promise this isn't, you're going to be like, oh God, what have I gotten myself into when I tell you this? But we recorded for like nearly 4 hours, and
oh my God,
it was in person. And when we like both stood up, we were like, or maybe we recorded for like 3, but we like hung out that day for like 4. And we were both like, that was a marathon of a hang.
Totally. Nada is very, very cool. And her book, shout out to Bad Thoughts.
Yeah.
It's funny. And also we were just talking about that Katie has the bumper sticker, horny for meditation. And Bad Thoughts really like explores the sort of like the underbelly of like wellness culture and I guess spirituality as capitalism. Because in America, we can turn anything into a business. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And franchise wellness, like we franchise Arby's, dare I say.
Exactly. America is the Arby's of enlightenment.
Yeah, truly. I mean, I think the story is called Earth to Lydia. I mean, it's kind of a thread throughout many of the stories in that book, which we love so much. But that one in particular, it's fresh in my mind because you mention her in this incredible article that you wrote for Harper's. Was that earlier this year or the end of last year?
It was. Maybe? Yeah. What year are we in? Are we in 2024? Yes, it was in 2024. Yes, it was earlier 2024.
Yeah, that was incredible and really like mirrors my trajectory in so many ways and everybody's. I mean, and not that I'm special, like just the way that was so funny. And yeah, I think I'm feeling so overwhelmed of things that I'm excited to ask you about. This has been years in the making and you truly are my favorite writer. I know you hear that all the time, but I'm also and favorite podcaster. Like I'm a big fan. That's how I discovered you. So I could just start in a million veins, but maybe we just start there with wellness. Like what was writing, if you could talk a little bit about that piece and why you wanted to do it and what the response was.
Totally. So that piece came out of a couple of years of hell, as much of my writing does. I don't think you have to suffer to make art, but I think I really don't. I mean, there's a lot of happy writers like E.B. White, right? Like Charlotte's Web is and all of his essays, they're very, Charlotte dies, but spoiler, but his essays, E.B. White's he's a happy camper. So I don't think you have to suffer to make art. But that being said, I do suffer and writing helps me to it's sort of like being an oyster with sand in it, or is it a clam? No, an oyster with sand in its shell. And writing is the substance that I emit to coat the grain of sand that irritates me so. So I went through a couple of years where my dad died, which I wrote about in a fictional way in Death Valley, veiled fiction, which is my most recent novel. And then I lost 2 people who took their lives. And it really spun me out because being a person who has depression, I was like, what separates me from them? And I became determined to fix my mental health. And I needed to, to confirm my diagnosis. And the more obsessed I got with being okay and the more therapy I was doing, the less okay I was. So the article really explores what is okayness? What is healing? How healed can we expect to be? And also particularly in America, the monetization of this idea of that we're going to arrive at this place of being healed where we're impervious to being human.
Yeah, and I think it was so incredible, and I'm so sorry for all of those losses.
Thanks.
I mean, gosh, I want to stay in the vein of wellness, but I think this kind of what I'm about to ask is about writing, but I think it might be in the vein of wellness in a way of the person who you quoted in that piece. I heard you say is someone that you worked with personally, and she gave you the advice, you heal by living. And I guess I'll just start there. I really loved that. Can you talk about that a little bit and how how do you heal by living? Like, how are you doing with that?
Well, I think there's like, you know, one thing that's like very hard for me that I find challenging in existence, especially as a person with anxiety. And I have a mind that's very black and white, right? Like I long for definitives. I long for absolutes because I want safety. And I think like false absolutes, right, which I think most absolutes are, feel comfortable to me, even if they're not real. And so, you know, I sort of thought like, okay, well, you heal like in a vacuum, or you like, I have to heal before I can live. But I think there is this middle path where it's like, when you are suffering, you know, still living, but also maybe like doing a little less, but not nothing. And that to me is like the biggest challenge is, you know, if I wake up and I'm feeling grief, I'm like, oh, I have to cancel all my plans, you know, or you better push through or something's very wrong with you, as opposed to maybe like, okay, I'm going to do some of the things that I planned to do today. And that is like that's something that I've learned. And, you know, because there aren't absolutes. Like, as my psychiatrist said, like when God invented mental illness, like God didn't consult the DSM-5, right? Yeah. And so I think that I was under the impression that like I had to heal and then I could go out and live. But it's like the woman whom I interviewed talks about, she's sort of the opposite. She's like, no, it's behavioral. You live. And by living, like that is how you heal. And I think it's probably something in the middle, you know, of our two. I think it's something in the middle.
What do you think? I mean, this is such a broad question. And like, if someone asked me this, I would be upset perhaps, or like just not know. But I'm just curious, like after writing that piece and the reaction to it and living in what your experiences are that led you to all those wellness practices and seeking. Do you have any idea of like, where do you think it's going to go in the culture? Or, I mean, who knows, of course, but I just am curious what your thoughts are, because even just thinking to the time that I first discovered you and your work of like where wellness was then to now to who knows what it'll be like.
Yeah. I mean, I think like most things in the culture, it'll probably continue to get stupider, I think. You know, I mean, it seems like maybe, I don't know. Schopenhauer has like a quote that like, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'd be paraphrasing anyway because it's a translation, but like what always was, always is. So in that sense, I think like the human experience, the internal experience is the same as it ever was. But that being said, I think that, you know, it seems like the sort of monetization and hashtagization and desire for definitives really and absolutes and like, you know, search engine listenings. And I imagine that it'll probably continue to get more reductive, maybe. At the same time, though, in that article, because I talked about in that article specifically, like how when I go online, like I'm getting these targeted ads for like ketamine therapy, right? And it's like, It will fix you, like that healing will happen in like a shot, right? Like it'll happen in one straight shot. And that's something to be sold because like, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to be fixed, healed, rendered okay in like 50 seconds. And so I think like corporate, you know, but at the same time, I do think that now we have more resources for mental health than ever before. Like I am so grateful, you know, to have depression and anxiety in 2024 and not in 1924, right? Or 1824. I mean, there's a huge difference. We have so much more knowledge and resources. So in that sense, maybe things aren't getting stupider and we're blessed.
Yeah, that's so true. And I obviously agree, but there's part of me sometimes that wonders without the language or without is ignorance bliss, you know, like is maybe back in those times, like, I mean, I don't know, maybe I would be dead, but sometimes I wonder if knowing too much knowing what I do is helpful or harmful. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a dialectic, right? Like on the plus side, like there's antidepressants, there's mood stabilizers. Like the poet Robert Lowell, who struggled with bipolar and who was in Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath's crew, both of whom, of course, Sexton and Plath did not survive. Robert Lowell, like, he survived long enough to be prescribed lithium for his bipolar. And he was like, he has this famous quote where he's like, if I had only known it was just a lack of salt in my brain.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there is something beautiful and even spiritual about science and like the ability to get relief. Right. And he just happened to be born at a particular time and like hang on. So in that sense, like I have a lot of gratitude for the understanding that we have and for science and for the art of psychopharmacology. But at the same time, it's like the monetization and the sort of the use of, I guess, just, the marketing is so silly. It's so silly. And the idea that we can be rendered okay. And also the all-consuming self-focus, right? Because in that article, I also talked about a friend of mine who's a therapist who was like, she basically said, like that it may be more of a we thing than an I thing, right? That healing may be more of a we thing and that it doesn't happen. Again, she was saying it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but sort of in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's like the thing I'm most eager to talk to you about is exactly that. As I was, writing my notes, preparing for this and listening to all these old episodes and reading all of your books over these last couple of weeks, all of my notes kind of fit into these 4 categories. And as I went through them, the categories, which we'll go into now, are So Sad Today, The Pisces, Milk Fed, Death Valley. And I didn't even try to make them that way. It just so easily, which is not surprising. Those are for the people at home that are, and the 2 people unfamiliar, those are her incredible books. But it was really lovely to hear you speak about each of these books without noticing like these eras of yours. And
well, thank you for bringing it back to the writing. I love that. Thank you.
When you were talking about that with the article you wrote most recently for Harper's that we've been talking about a little bit, is like, this is in the So Sad Today era, an interview I read of yours from years and years ago. In that, you were talking about probably my favorite, still to this day, probably my favorite essay that you've written, and I'm sure as many people feel the same, is this essay you wrote about your husband. And I think at that time that you were interviewed, it had just been published online. It's in So Sad Today. You were saying in that interview, you said, I actually feel relieved, like I don't have to explain his illness anymore. Like if I'm talking to someone and they ask, I can just be like, we'll send you a link. And I just would love to talk about that feeling, I guess, whether it's, related to what you were just saying about what your friend said and about this shared language we have for mental health, or about that piece you wrote on wellness. Like, do you still write to be able to essentially send someone a link and not have to and not that you write to do that, but could you just talk about that relief that comes from not only doing the writing, and I'd love to talk about that too, but from the actual sharing of it?
Yeah. So, for me, I think writing my process, to use that word, is really like, I'd say I could break it down probably into 3 parts. So there is the drafting process, there's the editing process, and there is the publication process. And in the drafting, I tried to be as messy as possible because I need to dismantle the perfectionist, right? Like a sculptor works with clay and they're given the clay that they then are shaping and shaping. But as a writer, we have to make our own clay, which is like the raw materials of the words. So there's all kinds of ways that I work to dismantle my own perfectionism so that I can get enough clay that I can then begin to sculpt later in the editing process. So for me, it's like, sometimes I dictated So Sad Today using Siri and a notes app. I dictated the rough draft of that and the rough drafts of the Pisces and Milk Fed. because I needed to like keep it casual and messy. And I didn't go back and look at anything that Siri had translated for me because I wanted it to just be that I had the permission to just go. You know what I'm saying? To just like push forward. So there was that element. There's other things I do to dismantle perfectionism and make it more like play, and everything from I'll use like bibliomancy or stickomancy, which is kind of using source texts and stealing words from public domain texts, you know, like not full sentences, but like often like nouns. Yeah, there's all kinds of games and sort of ways I have to try to make that drafting process like play. And I try not to think about the audience at all. Then in the editing process, I do think a lot about lucidity and communication, and I try to divorce myself from the work. So will divorce myself from having written the work, basically. So what I'll do is I'll send myself PDFs of chapters using like a different font than I usually use to try to read it as though it's somebody else's ebook. Because I really want like a very cold eye. So whereas I want like the warmest experience in the drafting process, I really want a cold clinical eye for the editing process. And then the publication process is where like any shame might come in or any fear might come in or a sort of joy at being like seen or witnessed, you know, and a fear of being witnessed. And so I don't think I ever write from the place of like, I need to explain myself, or here's going to be this like bottle, like encapsulated bottle of easy explanation for people or succinct explanation. But my husband has this neuroimmune disease that's so long. It's been a really, really long haul, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of unknowns about it and a lot of mystery. So it can be really exhausting when I tell people that my husband is disabled and they're like, you know, and they ask more about it because well-meaning people want to solve it. So they'll be like, have you tried the salmon and salad diet, right? Have you tried? And I'm like, honey, we've tried everything from like really intense HIV drugs to like worm therapy, right? Like the full end, from woo-woo to like really intense toxic Western medicines, you know, like the whole gamut. So it's really handy to have that whole journey, or at least up until that point, summed up there. So I don't have to explain. But I don't think I think about that in the drafting or the editing processes.
Can you talk a little bit about like specific, it doesn't have to be even specifically that one, but I reread it yesterday, and I can just imagine if I was you having something, like you said, difficult to explain. And you've talked about this before too. I feel like you will understand this feeling of trying to, I over talk and I over try to explain myself to want to be understood or to just perhaps sometimes to connect. But in writing, it's almost like be able to, you can't really necessarily say everything and obviously so eloquently, but just even the time in a conversation with someone, or when someone, like you said, is well-meaning and you don't want to come off, you know, or you're just trying to move the conversation forward. How did it feel when you did publish that? Like, can you talk about that relieving feeling, and have you had it since with other works?
Well, so like for those at home, the title of the essay is "I Told You Not to Get the Knish: Thoughts on Open Marriage and Illness," and you can Google it, and it's online. And that essay wasn't particularly difficult for me to publish because it was sort of in the shadow of another essay in the So Sad Today book, which is an essay about a vomit fetish. And that essay to this day haunts me. Basically, like when I wrote that essay, and it's probably like the most like frightening thing for me to ever publish, because it's like so just like if we are matryoshka dolls like of our former selves, then like that is like really like one of the littlest like baby for me like matryoshka dolls inside. And so and when I included it in the So Sad Today book, my editor and agent were like, are you sure you want to publish this? I was like, absolutely. And then we got like a lot closer to publication. I was like, you know what, I kind of want to pull the essay. And they were like, it's too late. It's already and so whenever like my Aunt Judy, like my 80-year-old Aunt Judy, or like my former boss, Craig, is like, I read So Sad Today, I always immediately go to that essay and like a hit of shame.
Does it feel good? And, people talk about like using writing to understand what you're thinking. Do you feel like that is something that happens for you? And do you feel like you are more understood when people have spent time? Are either of those things goals of yours when you're writing generally?
I think my writing like largely comes from this place of like survival and like feeling compelled. But I will say that writing is often extremely edifying. And like even sometimes when I look back and read something that I wrote like years ago, I'm like, oh, I felt the same way then. Like, and there's a sense of being like, I'm very much of my friend and I have a joke, like no new problems. And like, there is in a way, like, yes, there's something I guess that could be seen as frustrating about having the same sort of like thematic obsessions slash problems or struggles, let's say, that one has had their whole life. But I find something very relieving about it. And I'm like, oh, I am the same person. Like, this is not new. And there's a relief in that because I'm like, I survived that then. And so I think like, yes, there are all kinds of ways that writing can be edifying, like about the self and looking back on one's own work. But a lot of times, like I'll read something and I'm like, I wrote that. Not that I don't recognize like the themes, but just I'll be like, I almost like don't remember writing it in some strange way. Or like, especially if I read something and I think it's still holds up, like I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. I'm like, wow, I wasn't so bad, So it can be a really interesting way of relating to the self, to look back and look at one's own work and see like the themes that were there are still, even though there is evolution and there are different themes too, and different, like, as you said, eras or phases, it's the same as like if I read all of like some of my favorite writers, like Marguerite Duras, or if I read all of Thomas Bernhard, like each of their books are different, but like Marguerite Duras, like I'll see the same themes over and over, and like love, longing, limerence, right? Like they appear in, like, I don't know that there's any Marguerite Duras book that doesn't include some love, longing, limerence. Thomas Bernhard, the absurdity of existence, rants, right? So like a really powerful mind and a stream of consciousness in the brain. Clarice Lispector, also the absurdity of existence. I tend to be drawn to writers who are looking at the absurdity of existence. And so I think that often as writers, like we can write entirely different books, and yet like there is a lot of continuity. Philip Roth, sex, Judaism, right? Belonging versus isolation. So I think that there's a relief in that, and seeing like, oh, I do have some kind of core self.
Yeah, I think that seeing those patterns is comforting as a reader and viewer. And I guess I should come clean. I think I'm harping on that question so much because of an experience that I had recently where I think I maybe mentioned this to you in our email chain, but I broke my leg and my ankle in two places in May. And so it was my right leg, of course, so I couldn't drive or walk I was in a cast for 2 months. And anyway, I wrote a zine while I was in the cast. I had to do something, and it's like a printout I made, but it just came out, I guess, this week. And so I was sharing it. I did a little launch party in my neighborhood on Friday, and all my friends were there, and I read one of them, and it mentioned someone who everyone there knows. And I had changed the name, but it was very obvious. And I had to, part of it was I used to write a column for this magazine that doesn't exist anymore at the end of my 20s. And so it was sort of a low-hanging fruit making the zine. I revisited things I had written 5 years ago or more, and that spanned in that time, and which is, really stepping into the landmine of like being self-critical. But so much of it, I had that feeling of like, either, wow, that's so who I was then, or I still feel the exact same way now, or like, truly not remembering it, and I think, it is definitely comforting to see those patterns, or like you said, no new problems. And it's like the Richard Greenberg, I think, quote of nostalgia is longing for a time you knew you could survive. And that's definitely comforting. And then it also can be like, oh man, I'm having to learn this lesson again with different circumstances, but I also had to question, to myself, like, in a way, it kind of felt like, okay, if I give everybody this printout I made, kind of like you were saying about sending the link, maybe you'll understand me more and why I am where I am, or why and of course, like 90% of the people there, like, won't even read it. They just like being my friend, or like, it's not even like that. But I think I had to get honest with, like, as I was preparing for this, I was like, was there something there that I wanted to be seen in this way, or I wanted that intimacy with people? And so instead of just like telling them, I'm like, here's a printout, or a link, but then also wanting to make it good. So there's a reason for it. And I don't know, I guess I had to catch myself doing that.
Yeah. Wait, what is that quote? That quote is incredible.
Nostalgia is longing for a time you knew you could survive. It's good, right?
Oof. That's so good. And who is that?
I think it's the playwright Richard Greenberg. I'm pretty positive. Yeah,
that's an incredible quote.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Yes. Oh, that is good. Wow. I mean, I think that there's this dichotomy between, I think, like being seen, right, and like seeing oneself, and performativity versus, like, I think, like, it's funny, earlier you used the word connect, like connection. And I was thinking about Only Connect, the E.M. Forrester quote. And like, because I was reflecting recently, I was like, why do I write? Like, why do we write? Why do I write? Or why do I publish? Which I think is different than why do I write?
Yeah, totally.
So I do think that it's not just one thing, like there's different reasons. But in terms of the publishing of things, right, there's a desire to be seen, and then there's a desire to be like, to connect. And I think ultimately that is for me the most fulfilling, is that feeling of connection.
Yeah. I think hopefully for me too, but I think there's a character defect that I would like to like pray to be removed, which is this horrible thing. And maybe this is temporary, and because I feel like I haven't felt this way as much in the past, but maybe it's the age I am now, or, like feeling like time moved so quickly since the pandemic, and being sort of caught in a longing for a internet I knew I could survive, so to speak, or a 2019 or whatever. But I think there's this, the character defect is, my friend put it this way, where she was like, I think I was texting her about like probably like someone I had a crush on or something. And she was kind of saying, I feel like you're like me, and the sense of like, these are her words, where she was like, you think that if you just could have the time to sit across from somebody with a coffee and explain everything, you could like get them on your side, or you could get them to understand like why you are behind in your life, or why you don't have this or that, or why,